All right, so hopefully we've got the same group that we had just a few days ago. I'm starting in the middle of the presentation now. When we left a few days ago, I did show you how to look up your properties in flood zones, and hopefully you guys have spent a little bit of time doing that. Now I want to show you at the very end, we're going to jump out of the presentation again. We're going to look up some properties in your area. If you guys have any addresses you'd like us to look up, you might want to chime in and let me know what address you wanted us to look at. I don't want to just look at anybody's address unless there's a flood zone issue or something nearby. That's kind of what we're thinking as an example. But just to start up here where we left off, when we talk flood zones and talking about educating you on this topic, if we go to college and we get an A, or go to school in general and get an A, that's a good thing. But whenever you see the letter A with flood zones, that's a bad thing. So you're going to always want to remember that A's are bad. And if A is coupled with something else, that makes it, when A is all by itself, it's actually worse than A with something. Okay. So A by itself means it's a non-studied area, so it's more difficult. These terms here, all four of them, are basically interchangeable. When we say 100-year flood, any given year you have a 1% chance of flooding, which is also considered the special flood zone hazard area, and they also call it the base flood zone. Okay, so again, all of those terms are interchangeable. You guys should have access to this PowerPoint, so you shouldn't have to write all this down. Hopefully you've got a copy that they've sent you, or you have access to it. Again, talking flood zones, just so you understand it fully, A with something else is usually a studied area, and then A all by itself is a non-studied. The reason that's important for you is if we look up properties early on, like we want to teach you to do, and if you have an A zone all by itself, many times it's going to take me up to 5 weeks to get you out of a flood zone if it's an A all by itself, because it's non-studied, and I can't do it the quick way. Sometimes I can, but most of the time I have to do it the slow way, which is, again, possibly 5 weeks to get that property out. And in this market, I'm sure a lot of times you don't have 5 weeks. So A coupled but with something, a lot of times we can do those much quicker. Those are studied areas, and even though they're the bad flood zone, again, in Michigan today, 85% of the time, if someone shows up in a flood zone, I can get it out. So, or it qualifies. Another surveyor obviously can get it out. We just have to check the property and see if it truly is above the flood zone. But 85% of the time, we're finding that it is. That velocity zone is a brand new flood zone that they brought to Michigan. What is it? It's a zone that we've had on the oceans all along. And now all the way around our Great Lakes, all the big coastal regions with the big lakes, we now have flood zones that are raising up as much as 10 feet in some areas, which is really quite scary. So if you know of anybody who is building along the Great Lakes right now, they really do need to check the current maps, but more importantly, the future maps, because we have a lot of future maps coming out all the way around the coastal regions of Michigan. And those flood zones are raising pretty dramatically all of a sudden. I just want to remind everybody, if you have questions along the way, please feel free to ask. One of the things that comes up a lot of times is when we remove somebody from a flood zone, that's called a LOMA. And all those LOMAs are null and void every time FEMA comes up with a new flood map in that area. So just now, Kent County got all new flood maps just a month ago. So every single LOMA where somebody got out of a flood zone is now considered null and void over there. So if people, if you're selling houses in a county that's got a new flood map, I just want to make sure you're aware of that. The property owner might hand you a document and say, I'm already out of a flood zone. Well, that's no longer valid if the date of the LOMA dates behind, prior to the first flood map, okay? Or I'm sorry, for the current flood map of that area, then it would be a null and void LOMA, and that would go for the Lansing area as well. So when we talk flood zones, again, any given year, 1% chance of flooding. I would normally, if we were in a big group in a big room together, I would actually ask by a show of hands, how many people know what a floodway is? And a lot of times everyone would say, just kind of look at me with this blank look. Every one of you needs to know what a floodway is. And here's why. If there are a lot of properties in Michigan that are floodways, and a floodway is an area where it's a very high hazard area. It's going to be moving water. Okay. So in the event of a flood, the water will raise up in a river, stream, creek, drain. It will raise up, it'll spill over the banks. It'll inundate the ground around buildings. And somewhere from the thread of that creek outward, or the thread of the river outward, there's going to be this swath of moving water. Sometimes it's completely confined between the banks, but many times that moving water, it has spilled over the banks, and it's a big swath of moving water that is extremely dangerous. Okay. And we have to have that moving water in order for the flood waters to subside. But more importantly, buildings are not allowed to be built in floodways. However, as we'll look at like downtown areas, like in downtown Mason or downtown Lansing, a lot of our downtown areas today are all built on water, because that's how everyone got around back in the 1800s. They traveled on water, right? So all of our downtown areas built on water. Many of those buildings are right up on the water. And so if you are trying to sell, or if your client is about to buy a piece of property that is in a floodway, you need to definitely red flag it for your client. And here's why. If the property is ever damaged by a flood, if the property is ever damaged by a fire, you would never be able to rebuild if it's in a floodway. Nobody out there is going to tell you or your client that this property is in a floodway. This is all the more reason why you need to look it up with your two eyes before you show people properties. We want to make sure that your property owners are warned about floodway conditions. And again, they're buying these properties, but they have no idea that the property isn't worth what they think it is. Okay. And so again, we would call a floodway the highway for the moving water. Here is an example of a flood map. Okay. And they look a little bit different on the other site that I'm going to take you to. But this is one example of a flood map. And there I want to actually point out a few things on this map that is important. Okay. Remember when I say anything in blue is considered flood zone. So this whole area all the way across, everything here is blue. The entire area, that would be considered flood zone when you look at a flood map. So these buildings are completely blanketed in a flood zone. Okay. This building, if you were trying to sell this would most likely be hit with flood insurance. Okay. Because it's very close to a flood zone line. This building down here, obviously very close to a flood zone line. That too could also be nailed with flood insurance by the lender. Okay. So anytime your clients are in or near this blue, you should be concerned. You should question whether they're truly in a flood zone or not, because these maps, again, as I said, they're extremely approximate. Okay. Now the lines right here, these blue lines that I'm following, and this blue line, we've got cross hatching between those blue lines. That is called floodway. Okay. So anything between these two blue lines that are kind of a candy cane cross hatching effect, that would be considered moving water in the event of a 100-year flood, floodway. So if you were asked to sell this building right there, or maybe your client wants to buy that building, right? But if you were trying to sell it, do you think you'd have a hard time selling that building? Probably, right? Because it's being split by moving water, the floodway. I teach classes all over the country. I'm considered a national expert on FEMA flood zones. I've taught in Alaska, I've taught in Vermont, and I would ask my Alaskan surveyors or my Vermont surveyors, hey, could you get this one out of a flood zone? Could you ever get this house out of a flood zone? Every one of them would always say, no, that's floodway. We can't do that. And that's 100% wrong. Okay. I had one almost identical to this in downtown Lansing. And it was sitting up on almost like a cliff overlooking the river right in downtown. And it didn't sell for a couple of years. And finally, a realtor came to me and said, is there anything you can do for us? This house is being split by the floodway line. So I risked my life. I went out on the side of this cliff with my equipment and I shot the lowest point on that structure where it touched the ground. And that elevation of that structure was 6 feet above the flood zone. So when I tell you, when we look at these maps, the one thing that we have to make sure you understand is when we look at a flood map, we see blue, we have absolutely no idea where the flood zone is. Okay, it's very important. What really dictates where this flood zone is not this blue. It's going to be a surveyor, somebody like me, going out there and checking that elevation where the ground meets the structure. Okay, once I determine that that structure will not be touched in the event of a flood, then that structure qualifies to be removed from a flood zone. Okay, and so it's really important. If you guys have any questions, please make sure you chime in and stop me at any point. I know I cover this stuff pretty quickly, so but this floodway thing is extremely important, and most people have no idea what a floodway is. So the only person that's going to red flag a buyer. Yep, you have a question, ma'am?
Yeah, you had mentioned that if a house is in a floodway and it is damaged by a flood, it cannot be rebuilt. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yep.
Okay, what if it is in a flood zone and there's a fire? Can it be rebuilt?
So if it's in a flood zone, we can rebuild it. If it's in
floodway.
If it's in a floodway and there's a fire, you cannot rebuild that. They will not.
Okay.
So that building should have never been built. Okay. Many of these buildings today, in fact, almost all of them that are built and they're located in floodways, many of them were built prior to the very first flood map. So people didn't know there was a floodway or a flood zone there. So they built these buildings. Many of them are very old buildings. They're right up on rivers and very close to the flowing water. And that's how they get sucked into what we call floodway. So because they should have never been built, if they're damaged, the community would not let you rebuild it. You'd have to literally sell that property to the neighbor for a ballpark for the kids, or sell it to the city for, a park or a parking lot or something, but you cannot rebuild in that location. And nobody out there is going to tell your client about this floodway. You're going to have to be the one that tells them. Okay. There's no document that I get to check a box and say, danger, danger, floodway. Okay. So you guys need, all the more reason you need to look up your properties. My daughter, who's a realtor, maybe a year or so ago, told me, every property I showed today, Mom, was in a flood zone. And I'm like, oh my gosh, where were you? She was in Schwartz Creek, and she said there was no water anywhere near. So again, you might not see any water when you show properties, but they can definitely be in flood zones. So you need to be looking up every property when you pull your sheets on properties before you go to show them. The last thing you can do with each one of those sheets is literally type it in and search and make sure there's no flood zone anywhere near the properties that you're showing. Okay. And you should just get in the habit of doing that. And this is really protecting your client, but it's also protecting you, and your entire profession is based on referrals, and you want your clients to be happy. So again, this is part of what you guys should be doing every time. Okay. Anybody else have questions, or did I answer that question good? Is that okay, Susan? Okay, good. So if you have questions, please chime in. Okay. So I want to tell, let me see. Well, you know what? I'm going to skip the floodway story. I've got a couple floodway stories. I'll tell you one quick one. I got a lot of floodway stories, but there was this young couple. They lived downriver. I want to say they were like in the Brownstown area, downriver of Detroit, and they had some inheritance money, and they paid cash for a house. And therefore they had no lender, they did have a realtor, but the lender is usually the one that tells the client that they're in a flood zone, because at the 11th hour, they say we're going to force flood insurance. However, we would like that to change. We want the realtor to start telling, hey, this is in a flood zone long before that last 14 days that they're closing, right? So there was a realtor, nobody bothered to look at flood maps. The young couple bought this beautiful home. It had a basement. It was a manufactured home, but it was very nice, and it was on a big piece of property. And by that I mean it was almost an acre. And they shortly after they moved in, they started, wanting to do things to the house. They wanted to put a fence up, and the city said, no, we wouldn't let you put a fence up. And they didn't quite understand. Okay. And then they wanted to put a swimming pool in for their kids. They said, no, you can't do that. And they wanted to put a shed up. Nope, you're not allowed to put a shed up. And so eventually they wanted to remortgage, and the mortgage company said, well, you're completely in a flood zone. You're going to have to pay flood insurance. So they hired us, and we came out there. The problem is not only was the entire house in a flood zone, it was in a floodway. Okay. And this was a newer house, so the community really screwed up. They allowed this house to be built in the middle of this moving water swath. So in the event of a flood, the whole house could have been uprooted. Okay. And at least somebody was smart enough to say, no, we're not going to let you put a fence up, because a fence can become a weapon. It can actually become like a spear or something as it's uprooted and shoved downstream. It can harm, property. It can harm people. Same thing, any kind of, you cannot increase the hazard. Okay. So you can't put a second story on, you can't increase your footprint of your house. You're not allowed to put a swimming pool, because all those things can be uprooted, shoved downstream, cause damage to other people's property, and they can also cause loss of life. So again, I can't stress that enough. Floodway is very bad. Okay. Anytime you have a floodway, it's a bad story. All right. So we want you to just start asking questions prior to, the offer being made. And some of those questions, knowing that the seller has options is important. Letting the seller know that if we can't get you out of a flood zone, maybe we can do what's called an elevation certificate and get the premiums down. So again, you've got different options. You can possibly do a LOMA. That's plan A. We would try and do a LOMA on the property. If not, an elevation certificate may get your premiums down. And then lastly, this, compliance versus non-compliant. When somebody is about to buy a home and it's in a flood zone, we would encourage them, if we can't get them out of a flood zone, we'd encourage them to get a price for flood insurance. Okay. Because a lot of times people still want to buy the home. They don't want to walk away. So they go get a price, and maybe the price comes back at $4,200 a year. So then what we do is we would then say, okay, there is a way for us to get premiums down. Would you like us to try? And so we would do what's called an elevation certificate. Now, an elevation certificate is a 4-page document, and it's actually reports everything about the house. It tells us the elevation of all your mechanicals, your garage floor. It basically reports your true level of risk. Okay. In the event of a flood, how bad is it going to get? Is my entire first floor going to be underwater, or is it just going to be a foot of water around the crawl walls, or how bad is this going to be? Right. And so we would give 2 documents to your buyer. The first one would be an elevation certificate, which reports the current situation, your current conditions. And so the buyer would give that first elevation certificate to the insurance agent and say, I really want to buy this house. Can you tell me, can you get the premiums down from $4,200, knowing what elevations everything is at? The insurance agent would feed everything in and come back and say to your buyer, yes, now it's not $4,200, it's only $2,700. Well, the buyer is still not happy, but we've given the buyer a second document. Okay. And again, we're trying to save the deal. That second document, we have a box check that says proposed construction. It's basically some changes that your buyer would be able to do to the house to get premiums down once the buyer owns the house. Okay, so a buyer can't come in and start doing stuff. They don't even own the house, right? But we want to teach the buyer that there's ways we can possibly save a lot of flood insurance premiums and maybe make this house marketable again. So that second document we give them, we say install a couple of these engineered flood vents, raise some mechanicals, maybe your AC units on the ground outside, we would have to elevate that. And so that second document, your buyer is going to give to the insurance agent and say, okay, what if I buy the house and make these changes? What then? And your insurance agent will plug it in and say, oh, well, now it's only going to be $356 a year instead of $2,700. Okay. So again, now your buyer still has a guarantee that if they buy the house, they're going to be able to get those premiums down just by making a few small changes to the house. So this is my own little recipe on how to save a deal if your buyer really still wants to buy the house. Okay. Yep, go ahead.
Is there some sort of notification when new flood maps are done? Would a homeowner know they need to get a new LOMA?
Nope, nobody bothers to tell them. No, in fact, right now, nobody knows that their LOMAs are all null and void in Kent County. Okay. FEMA used to actually revalidate a bunch of the LOMAs in an area, but I think it just got to be too much. So most of the time they're not revalidating the LOMAs anymore. So many homeowners can revalidate their own LOMA, and we just tell them to call my office and we'll tell them how to do it for free. So if you have a homeowner who wants to revalidate a LOMA, like we actually had a phone call this morning from somebody in Lowell who we removed from a flood zone back in 2019, and they want to put an addition on their house. And they're asking to see the most updated flood map for the area because they're thinking that we've amended the map. We did amend the map, the previous map, because now they have new ones as of a month ago. But the previous map would not show the flood lines moving. It would just show the case number, okay? Showing that we've amended the structure. Once somebody puts an addition on a house, then the LOMA that's done is now null and void also. Okay, so this gentleman wants to put an addition on his house. So what we're going to suggest for him is we need to come back out there. We need to shoot the ground in the area where he's going to put his addition. And then we're going to shoot the area where he's going to put that addition. And we're going to tell him whether we can remove the actual ground from a flood zone. If we can, we would just box out the area around his house, box out the area around his addition, completely remove the ground from a flood zone, and then he could build completely out of a flood zone. Again, there's all these different ways. I'm kind of getting into a little bit too much detail here, but depending on situations, a lot of times we can help people. Okay. And that business about compliance versus non-compliant, that's the difference between a house that hasn't been vented or the actual mechanicals haven't been raised. Most older homes today that were built in flood zones are usually non-compliant homes, but we can take a non-compliant home, make a few changes to it that it does not cost very much. And we can then bring those premiums down a lot for flood insurance and make the house marketable again. So hopefully I answered that question a few minutes ago. Any other questions, please chime in, okay? When we talk about new construction in flood zones, as I was just kind of alluding to a minute ago, some people will come into an area and see an entire piece of property blanketed in a flood zone, and they'll think that the property is not buildable, or if they want to build, they're going to have to build in a flood zone, and that's not true. A lot of times if we have a big piece of property and it's all in a flood zone, we'll come in and we'll shoot some elevations and find that there's a little bit of an elevated portion. So if it's a 20-acre parcel, we might find an entire 1 acre of it elevated above the flood zone. So we can come in, we can box that area out, remove it from a flood zone. Now you can build your new house, your septic field, your well, your barns, everything completely out of a flood zone if the ground is already above, okay? And again, that's just another form of amendment to vacant property. Another option, if we have a bunch of property blanketed in a flood zone and it's too low and I can't get any of it out, then we can petition the state of Michigan or the city, depending on who has jurisdiction. And we would ask them if we can raise the ground up and build out of a flood zone. Okay. Our state of Michigan law says when they're regulating properties which are in flood zones, they will not allow you to bring in more than 300 cubic yards of fill. So 300 cubic yards of fill is still quite a bit. And sometimes we can raise the ground up. We can build a new house out of a flood zone and the client never pays flood insurance because we're going to do what's called a letter of map amendment with fill. Okay. So there's all these different ways we can help your clients. Elevation certificates, people used to use them to prove they're not in a flood zone. FEMA won't let you do that anymore. You have to go through the actual LOMA process. So some of your clients might say, but I have an elevation certificate, I'm already out of the flood zone, and that's not necessarily the case. Again, any LOMAs that were done were null and void when the new maps came out. So the LOMA has to be dated after, but any elevations that your client has on an elevation certificate, there's a lot of mistakes on elevation certificates. We catch a lot of mistakes. So if your client does have an elevation certificate, we always encourage you, send it to our office. We'll check it over. We'll see if it looks like there's no mistakes, then that's good. Okay. But if there are a lot of mistakes, we would suggest getting a second opinion. And whenever you guys are talking flood zones and you're calling us about the flood zone issues on properties with structures, we are going to always ask you, we're going to say, what year was the house built? That is very critical. The reason that's critical is there's these pre-firm structures and post-firm structures, okay? And we can do a lot for people who built their houses before the very first flood map. So firm means flood insurance rate map, okay? So if there was no flood map when a building was built, then they're not going to punish you for building a house in a flood zone. There wasn't a flood zone at that point. So again, if we have an older home, we have a lot more flexibility in helping the homeowners. If it's a newer home and it was built in a flood zone after the first flood map came out, then they kind of punish you. You don't have as many options. Okay. And there's a couple of laws that that basically are affecting elevation certificates. They're no longer requiring those elevation certificates. And I sometimes would suggest using one to get your premiums down. Insurance agents, no offense to any insurance agents, but many of them are trained by FEMA. And I would like to train the insurance agents because FEMA trains them and FEMA's more self-serving. They want to train an insurance agent that if you have a basement that goes into the ground 8 feet, we're going to rate you on this basement that's in a ground, 8 feet. That in the old days or more recently, that used to be a -8 rating, and that would be $8,000 a year. So they're not rating the houses the same way anymore. They've got a new rating system, and we're still figuring that rating system out. But they used to rate it based on how deep the basement was. Anybody have any questions, please ask, okay? Let me look. Insurance agents, basically, I was telling you how they basically are not really up to speed completely. They, many times insurance agents will look at the lowest floor in a house and they say, oh, look at you, you're like 6 feet into a flood zone. You do not qualify. And that's not true. By rule of thumb of FEMA, if the ground outside of the house at its lowest point, if that ground is at or above the flood zone, then that qualifies the structure from being removed. We don't care how deep the basement is. If the ground around the house is high enough, then that structure does qualify to be removed from a flood zone. And many people misunderstand that, okay? And if I can't get you out of a flood zone, we immediately switch gears and we say, okay, where's your first floor? Does this house have a basement? If it has only a crawl space, a lot of times we can install some flood vents and get those premiums way down. Okay, so just to recap what we've talked about, Plan A is doing a LOMA, letter of map amendment, right? What is a LOMA again? It's this king of documents that basically removes the requirement for flood insurance. And so that's plan A. Plan A is let's lift the house out of a flood zone by a letter of map amendment. We're not physically lifting the house, of course, but I just wanted to give you my cute little guys here. And then if I can't get the house out of a flood zone, we switch to plan B. And plan B would be, okay, will an elevation certificate help? Yes or no? If we have a non-compliant house and we make it compliant, then a lot of times an elevation certificate will get those premiums way down, as I had already mentioned. Okay. I do want to tell you this sad story. This is probably one of the worst ones that I've seen, but it was either way. We've seen a lot of sad stories when it comes to flood zones and the fact that people are so uneducated when it comes to this. There was a realtor. She calls me and said, I have a house. I have a buyer. This house is bank owned. It's on the Huron River. Come out here and check it. It's in a flood zone, but I want to see if we can get it out because the house is only 2 years old and it's a beautiful big house with 6 bedrooms. Please come and check it. It's bank owned. So we went and checked it. And as I'm out there with my fancy equipment, pushing buttons, the neighbor comes over and says, sad story. And I'm like, what happened? And he said, that little house over there, the family who built this big house, this was their dream home. They used to live in that house that I'm living in, but they sold it to me, moved their family in here. They had 6 kids, moved in here a year and a half ago. And all of a sudden they started being forced to pay flood insurance. Nobody bothered to tell these people that there was a chance they could get out of flood insurance. So after a year of being forced flood insurance, they couldn't afford the flood insurance. It was too expensive. So they lost their home to the bank. And again, they walked away from the house because they couldn't afford it. Meanwhile, my equipment's telling me this house was never in a flood zone. And I looked at the guy and I said, where is the family today? And he says they're living out of the back of the Chevy Astro van so their kids can finish out the school year. So they lost their dream home because nobody bothered to educate them. Okay. They didn't know that we could come out and tell them, I'm 100% sure I can get this out. And I'm going to get you a whole year worth of premiums back if they were paying premiums. That would have been a great Christmas for them. But obviously that was a bad thing. So it's all about education. That's really what we're talking about here today. People, every one of us here today knows somebody who's in a flood zone. I guarantee it. So we just need to let people know that they have options. Most people do not know they have options. We're doing better. We're kind of spreading the word, but I feel like a one-man show on top of a little, a little crate here trying to preach to everybody. Again, shooting the structure is the key thing. It's called the lowest adjacent grade, where the ground meets the structure. Just because a structure shows up in a flood zone does not mean it's truly in a flood zone. When we look at flood maps, we see blue. We have no idea where the flood zone is still. That's how inaccurate it is. Okay.
Carol,
Yes, ma'am.
we have a question in the chat.
Okay.
Does a Bilco door entrance to a Michigan basement have a condition to the door entrance being the ground level, or is it treated differently?
Wow, that's a good question. Okay, so for years and years, we bounced back and forth with FEMA on this topic, and I kept saying I want something in writing, and they wouldn't give it to me. Well, after a while, I got smarter, and I realized that even though, in fact, you know what? If you can sit tight, in 1 second, I'm going to have a slide, and it's going to illustrate something almost very similar to that question. So give me 1 second, and I'm going to explain something here in a minute. We'll come back to that question in just a minute, okay? So here's the question right here. So the question was asked at this perfect timing. So that this house right here has a walkout basement, okay? And it just so happened the builder, wanted that extra value, but he didn't want to pull the house out of the ground any further. So he sunk it into the ground. He's got a basement with a sunken patio that's about 2 feet into the ground here. So the ground right at the opening of this house, the lowest adjacent grade, is about 2 feet into a flood zone. Okay. So most surveyors would say, oh no, this doesn't qualify for being removed, and FEMA would say, yep, that's right, lowest adjacent grade, it's into a flood zone, 2 feet, you can't get this house out. Well, that's not true. And here's why. We've got what's called higher intervening ground right here. This ground right in this area is above the flood zone, and it's going to stop the water from coming from this lake, this flooding source. If in the event of a flood, the water's going to raise up, but it's never going to get over the hump, okay? And so what I do in a case like this, and again, it's just a matter of education, is I would come in and I would do a topographic survey of the whole area, and then I would, on my survey, I would draw a line where the true flood zone line is, where that water would actually get to, okay? And I can prove to FEMA with my drawing that this higher intervening ground will block the water from ever getting to my structure. So that house would qualify. And so let's go back to the question. The question asked about some type of a lower entry or a lower door in the side of a house to get into maybe a Michigan basement. As long as we have higher intervening ground and it's at or above the flood zone, we could qualify that structure from being removed. And again, many, many years have gone by and a lot of people have been told no on this subject, but that's just not true. We can do it. We just have to do a little more work, and it costs a little more money to the client to prove it. If you have any follow-up question to that, let me know, okay? And so again, as a recap, you know, we have a couple different types of lomas, and we kind of talked about them. We've got, you know, the regular loma, which takes a little longer. We got those electronic lomas that are quick. We've got this thing called out as shown, where you might look up the properties. Let me tell you one quick thing, and I forgot to tell you about this. I don't think I told you in the first half of this class, is in Michigan and all over the country, we have these companies called flood check companies, okay? So our federal government is requiring that whenever properties are bought and sold, and this is anywhere in the country, whenever properties are bought and sold and they have a structure on the property, the lender is required by federal law to run what's called a flood check, okay? And this is across the board. Why is that? Because 85 plus of our mortgages, 85% or more of our mortgages today are federally backed mortgages. So the federal government is forcing lenders to do flood checks. Well, so 2 weeks before the property's being sold, the lender goes over to their computer, they type in all the information on the structure, they push a button, it goes off to La La Land all the way down to CoreLogic in Texas, or over to Pennsylvania. There's Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We got a couple of those flood check companies there. And that information comes back into the lender's computer and it populates the document, and in a matter of minutes sometimes. And so what just happened? A computer just now made that decision as to whether to force flood insurance, yes or no. So these flood check companies, none of which are located in Michigan, all over the country, are making these decisions, yes or no, on our properties here in Michigan. How many times do you type an address into Google Earth and it plots up down the road somewhere? So that's what the problem is with these flood check companies. They're using computers to look up these properties. We need actual human beings to look up the properties, okay? So if you look up a piece of property for your client and you see that it's really not in a flood zone, but the lender's flood check company comes back and says, yes, force flood insurance, you can go back, or your client can go back to the lender and say, take a second look. Lenders can turn back to those flood check companies for free and say, take a second look. We want somebody to actually lay eyes on the property. Okay, that's number one. Flood check companies make a lot of mistakes. Let's say the flood check company makes a mistake in the other direction, which happens a lot. And they say, no, you're good. But you've already looked the property up and you know that there's a flood zone touching the corner of the house or very close to the house. At that point, you should not trust the flood check company. You should be, actually protecting your client. You should hire a surveyor to go out and check that lowest point. By now, usually people have asked us how much. Usually it's $200 or $300 for us to check a structure, okay? And we go out, we check not only the house, but we're checking the detached garage, the barn, the shed. all for that price of $200 or $300. And then we're going to come back and say, okay, the house qualifies, the barn qualifies, the garage is still in, and we give your client the choice. How many of those structures, if they qualify, do you want us to remove all of them or just the main residence? And again, when flood premiums, whenever somebody is going to force flood insurance on a property, they're going to force it one structure at a time. Okay, it's not like homeowners insurance. It's flood insurance, and it goes one building at a time. So I have a client who's up in the Thumb area, and he's got 9 outbuildings. I could get his residence out, I could get a garage out, but all those barns, sheds, and other garages, I couldn't get those out of a flood zone. So he had to write a flood policy on every single building that we couldn't get out. Okay, so I just want to drive that point home, that flood insurance is charged on one building at a time. Okay, if anybody has additional questions, please let me know. So these are all different things that we've, again, one last point on what I was just speaking on. If the flood check company comes back and says, no, you're not in a flood zone, but you know that your client is, and you have a surveyor go out and check it, you can stop right there. You can tell the client, okay, now we have peace of mind. If a couple months go by and this mortgage gets sold, the new lender can come in and force flood insurance. We know we can get it out. Okay, so your property owner doesn't have to go through the LOMA process. We can just give them peace of mind that it qualifies to be removed if it becomes an issue later, the mortgage gets sold, a home equity loan happens, or any of those types of things. Okay, again, yep, go ahead.
Or a flood insurance coverage, either yay or nay?
Okay, great question. I've actually had quite a few of those come back. And so you're kind of asking a legal question, so I can't really answer the liability aspect, but I can tell you that the flood check companies make a lot of mistakes. And I know one of my clients wanted to sue the flood check company because he was going to have to pay $4,200 a year. And him and his wife had bought this house just a few months earlier. The same company said, nope, you're good. Then the mortgage got sold. Then it came back and the same company said, nope, you're in now. And so he wanted to sue the company, and he never did, because we came back and we got his premiums from $4,200 down to $300 and something. So, again, many times people might want to sue those companies. I have no idea if they are liable or not. One other question that I want to answer, and nobody's actually asked it yet, was what if I get somebody out of a flood zone and then they flood? What if you tell a client to oh no, you don't need flood insurance, and then they get out of it and then they flood? The fact is it can flood anywhere. If it rains, anywhere it rains, it can flood. Okay, it doesn't always flood to the 100-year flood zone. It can be a 500-year flood zone. Okay, so I always tell everybody about my father. My dad, he passed away last year, but for years and years, my dad would always move to a flood zone, and he'd always call me up and say, honey, get me out of this. And then he'd say, oh, it's okay, it's only $400 a year. Then he'd call me back and say, it's $2,400 a year, get me out. And I would always go and get my dad out of these flood zones that he kept moving to. And then he would go back, because my dad's like Mr. Super Safety, wear suspenders and a belt kind of guy, right? And he would go back and buy that flood insurance for only $200 a year, because now we got him out of the high risk zone. We put him into a low risk zone. Nobody's forcing it anymore. But my father always wanted to carry the insurance. So that's really important to note, that you never want to tell people not to pay flood insurance. We just want them to pay their true level of risk. Now, one more quick point I want to make, because I think we're getting up close to the top of the hour, and I want to jump out of this and show you how to look up your properties again. But flood insurance doesn't cover hardly anything. People will pay a lot of money for flood insurance, and it only covers 2 things. And you need to educate your clients on this topic. It covers mechanicals, like a furnace, water softener, water heater, air conditioning unit that might be on the ground. your generator might be out there. It covers those mechanicals that service the building. So in the event of a flood, flood insurance will cover that. The other thing it covers is your foundation. You have to have cracked foundation walls, something like that the damage really occurred. What does flood insurance not cover? It doesn't cover all of the stuff that usually happens. It doesn't cover all your contents. It does not cover cleanup. It does not cover drywall replacement, mold remediation. It doesn't cover any of those things. And those are the most common things that actually happen in a flood. So again, I kind of got off on a tangent, but I just wanted to make sure you guys understood that flood insurance does not cover that much, okay? So I think I already kind of explained the compliant versus non-compliant. These are some of the things that we would do to make a house compliant and get those premiums from $4,000 down to $400 a year, okay? That's a typical vent you're going to find in a lot of foundations. That's what an engineered flood vent looks like. If you guys want to learn about engineered flood vents more, you can Google the word smart vent, S-M-A-R-T, for smart person, smart vent, okay? They're the king of vents, and they actually have videos on there to show you all about flood vents and how they perform, okay? And the whole theory behind a flood vent, just so I can show you real quick, is if we put a vent in, we get the water to equalize on both sides of the wall. The water would free flow under the house and it would equalize. So we do not have cracked foundation walls, okay? And that's why FEMA will literally let you go from thousands down to hundreds if you install flood vents in your foundation, okay? I'm gonna zoom past these last couple things. Again, placement of the flood vents is critical. You kind of want to ask a professional, somebody like me, to help you place it. You guys are super smart now and you're the experts. And this PowerPoint does have a bunch of resources and stuff. So I just want you to go ahead and look those things up. That's my contact information. It is part of the PowerPoint. Again, I'm going to jump out of this PowerPoint and I'm going to show you how to look up your properties again. And if anybody, let me see, I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to do a new share. Okay. Let me get to the new share page. Here we go. So again, to look up your properties, you would normally go to a Google search engine. Okay. And for some reason, my Google search engine went away. Let me see if I can get it back. Give me 1 second. There we go. Gotta move you guys over so I can find it. There we go. Oh my goodness. There we go. Okay. So I'm gonna take you to that Google search engine. There it is. And like we did the other day, we went ahead and we typed in, our website, and I take you to my website, which is floodzoneexpert.com. Okay. And it says Alpine Land Surveying there. And so we click on that, and you're in the right spot when you get to the all the blue. We want to go up to the corner where it says resources. Okay. We click on that, and then we click at the very first button here that says click here to check a structure. Okay. And again, you click there. Now we're taking you to the actual FEMA website. Okay. And every time you come to this site, FEMA has basically broken the site. So we want to close all the boxes that pop up and get in our face. We're closing those. You go up to the corner where you see the papers stacked, and you click on that papers, and the middle check mark right here where it's blue, NFHL, National Flood Hazard Layer. We're going to click on that little diamond, and we're going to turn on every LOMA in the country. So we're clicking LOMA. Okay. Now we're going to close that box out. Does anybody have an address they want us to look up? If not, I'm going to look up something. You guys I'll give you a minute in case you do have an address. So right now I just was going to zoom into Mason. Okay. Because this is just one of many of the cities around. And as I was saying, a lot of these cities have water because they were built, on water. And it is taking FEMA a little bit of time to load, but we're getting it up there. These purple dots are all lomas that were done in downtown Mason. And we have this cross hatching. It kind of looks like a candy cane. Hopefully you remember that's floodway. So anywhere we have that candy cane effect is going to be moving water. Okay. And so I'm going to zoom in to a couple different places here, just to show you what we're dealing with. And again, if you had an address in Mason of somebody's house and you were looking it up, you would put the address in the upper left corner, and then you'd put search in, and it would zoom in to some property, right? And so as you can see, now it's hard to see all this when all these lines are in our way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn everything off for 1 second so we can peek at these houses that are overlapping with all the flood zones. So I'm going to go up in the corner. I'm going to shut down the National Flood Hazard layer right there. And you can see, here's all the houses, all right? So here, if you were trying to sell maybe this house, okay, or maybe one of these houses over here, you would be looking this up. So now I'm going to go turn this back on, and you can actually see, oh my gosh, where's all these flood zones, right? And look at how they're coming through, and they're going over the tops of homes. This house completely in a floodway. See that one? It's got a beautiful swimming pool. If you were trying to sell that house, again, would you have trouble selling it? So maybe this house, this is a Loma right here. That could be on this house, or it could be on your house, whichever house you're trying to sell. So you would want to left click with your mouse on the purple button, okay, or the purple dot, left click and open this up. And I'm going to arrow over until I see this page that says download letter here. Okay, this is 206 Okemos Road. Okay, and I'm just going to look and see, is there another Loma in here? Nope, there's no other Loma. So it's just one Loma under that purple dot. Sometimes you're going to see more than one Loma. So I'm calling up the document. I said download letter here. This house actually got removed from a flood zone. Okay, and that's what we're seeing, that word removal. And you come down, here's the address, 206 Okemos. It's the Rainier Creek that's nailing it, okay? And again, this is the document that this client would give their lender. So if you were looking up the property and this is the next door neighbor house, you'd say, well, they got out of a flood zone. Maybe my client will qualify, right? Or you could actually print it because maybe it's your client's house, or maybe it's the house that your client wants to buy, and you can show that you've already gotten them out of a flood zone there. Okay, I think I just exited the wrong button, which I did. So now you're going to see me do this again so everybody remembers it. I'm loading the flood zone map, and you're going to save that to your desktops and laptops. And we only have 2 minutes left, so if somebody has an address, you might want to give it to me. And if not, I'm just going to.
Bill,
Yeah, go ahead.
is the text realist program that shows the flood maps, is that somewhat reliable for a first guess?
Yeah, so many of those flood zone maps that are overlaid with our aerials, and I'm sure it's this one as well, there's a shape file for the flood zone, and that what they do is they float that shape file into the program. So most of our maps that you're seeing flood zones are really helpful, and they're probably very accurate because they're just the same flood zone layer that we've got here. The only reason I like this map so much better is because I can actually turn on all the Lomas in the area. So, right. And that's kind of why I like this better, is because when we zoom into a particular area, a lot of times FEMA tells you our maps are really accurate. Well, if they were really accurate, we wouldn't be able to remove so many people from a flood zone. So we like to be able to see those nearby Lomas. And again, there's a lot of people in downtown Lansing that are in flood zones. You can see all these houses that are being, literally blanketed in flood zones. And this is Lansing area right here. And again, as we move further to the east of Lansing, Okemos has a lot of people in flood zones as well. See, this is City of Lansing. The date on these maps, remember I talked about the most current date? There's a Lomar, somebody came in and redid this chunk of this map in 2022, okay? And so every time a map panel gets redone, it's no longer valid. Over here, you can look, see how this is 2011. This is, these are all, you know, here's Meridian Township and this is up near Okemos and stuff. So if anybody has any more questions, just let me know, but we are right up on the 11 o'clock hour. So I think I'm gonna do class dismiss, but feel free to call my office. If you guys have ever want anything looked up, we'd be happy to help you look things up. Okay, we do that for free all the time. Okay, so I'm gonna say class dismissed and you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.
Both the presentations be sent to us via email because I didn't get one from the first one.
I think they're sharing them somewhere. We can actually, my office can email them to you, but usually the host will share that presentation. But if for some reason they don't, reach out to my office and I'll be happy to email you a copy of this, okay?
Okay, thank you.
The PDF of the slides from today and Monday are in the chat.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you, Carol, for all of your information and joining us this week. We really enjoyed having you. And thank you to everybody on Zoom for joining us today. Just a quick little update. You have entered to win an Education Madness basket at our April industry update. The winner will be selected from those members who attended the most education classes offered within the month of March. It's been a great month for education and we look forward to putting this on again for you next year. Please remember our next industry update is with Matt DeFanis on April 20th, beginning at 9 a.m. with the Home Ownership Discrimination Then and Now presentation. We hope to see you all there. Thank you and have a great day.